Good evening and welcome to PJTN Online. I'm your host, Laurie Cardoza-Moore. I want to thank you for joining me tonight. Tonight, this program is for you, our PJTN friends and family. We are going to discuss the issues that are surrounding Israel, our Jewish brethren, and the rise of anti-Semitism. We are also going to talk about our biblical responsibility to stand with our Jewish brethren and defend the state of Israel against the rise of this age-old hatred. I want to thank our new guests for joining us tonight and some of our friends who've been with us from the very beginning. Again, this program is for you, to give you information so you can share with your family and friends, to help you understand what's happening around the world and what our role as Christians is. I also want to just mention to those of you who are just tuning in tonight for the first time, if you're not familiar with proclaiming justice to the nations, I want to encourage you to visit our website at PJTN.org. Again, you can visit us and like us on Facebook. You can follow us on Twitter and Instagram. But our mission at Proclaiming Justice to the Nations is to educate Christians about their biblical responsibility to stand with our Jewish brethren and defend the state of Israel against the rise of global anti-Semitism. And we accomplish that mission by producing award-winning documentary films that we distribute through our 20 global media partners through the National Religious Broadcasters Convention. These broadcasters enable us to produce or to air our programs around the globe in 200 nations, reaching over 2.6 billion potential viewers. So I want to thank you for tuning in and for learning more about who we are. Some of the programs that we have produced, the Focus on Israel show, you can also tune in. That's another opportunity to learn more about PJTN. We're reaching 2.6 billion viewers, and we also want to encourage all of you to become a PJTN Watchman. We're going to talk about some of the things that are going on around the globe, and especially the rise of anti-Semitism this evening. But we need sponsorship. We need help from people like you, from friends like you on Facebook. So we have started a campaign at PJTN.org. Again, visit our website, sign up to become a PJTN Watchman. And we're encouraging our PJTN Watchmen to make a $20 contribution every month to support the work of what we're doing as we are educating Christians around the globe. Again, 20 media partners, 200 nations, over 2.6 billion viewers are tuning in to watch our programming around the world. And of course, we hear from many of our friends and supporters, our viewers around the world who share information with me that they didn't learn or were not aware of. And so they're so grateful for our programming to help them share this information with their family, their friends, and their children as well. Again, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram. Tell your family and friends about PJTN and ask them to join us on Wednesday night, 6 p.m. at PJTN Online. You can also tune in to our Focus on Israel. It's an award-winning Focus on Israel program, it's 30 minutes long. Daystar TV is broadcasting that program every Sunday night, starting at 11 p.m. Central Time, 9 p.m. Pacific. So that's a way for you to tune in during the week to watch, to learn more about these important issues surrounding Israel and our biblical responsibility. I also want to encourage you to go to God TV on Monday evenings. Our Focus on Israel show is airing there. And of course, all of our other media partners, if you'll visit our website and learn more about how you can tune in and watch our other award-winning programs. But you will have to check your local listings to find out where you can catch Focus on Israel. I also want to encourage you all to visit our events page on the website for any upcoming events, because you never know when we're going to be in your neighborhood, and we'd love for you to come out and meet us. February 12th at 6:30 p.m., I will be speaking at a rally in Newton, Massachusetts, downtown at the Town Hall. For those of you who are following our textbook, our K through 12 outreach textbook initiative, I want to encourage you that live in the Boston area or even from other communities across the state of Massachusetts and the surrounding states. Newton, Massachusetts, the community has taken on the initiative to expose the anti-Semitic, anti-American, anti-Judeo-Christian, pro-Islamic content being taught to their children in their public schools. This issue, Newton, Massachusetts, like many communities, has been fighting this battle with their local school board and their superintendent and the teachers since 2012. And so they are hosting a rally. They're inviting people in the community to come out to learn more, and I will be there speaking. So I'm hoping that I'll get to see you there if you live in the Massachusetts area. Also, February 13th, I will be at Florida Atlantic University in Boca Raton, Florida at 7 p.m. We are going to be screening our documentary, Boycott This. For those of you who are not familiar with Boycott This, again, you can go to our website, our store page, and you can order any of our documentary films. But Boycott This was actually produced in a satirical format for a millennial generation. The growing threat of anti-Semitism as it's being expressed through the BDS, or the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement. If you're not familiar with BDS, the goal is to boycott Israeli products, to divest from Israeli companies, and sanction Israel, to punish them for false accusations of being an apartheid state, of oppressing the Palestinian people or the Arab people, which could not be further from the truth. There's no basis in fact. In fact, the documentary, we decided to go on a trip to Israel ourselves with comedian Brad Stein, and to find out the facts, the truth. And we interviewed Arabs, both Muslim and Christian Arabs, to get to hear from them if Israel really is an apartheid state. And so we produced this documentary. We're going to be screening it again in Boca Raton at Florida Atlantic University, 7 p.m. February 13th. So if you're in South Florida, we invite you to join us that evening for that event. February 20th, 6 p.m., America Connected. It is the President's Day dinner, and that's going to be at the Boca Raton Marriott Hotel in Boca Raton, 7 p.m., or I'm sorry, 6 p.m., and I want to encourage you again, if you're in town, I believe there are still tickets available, and I will be speaking there about our initiative with proclaiming justice to the nations. February 27th, I will be back in Boca at Florida Atlantic University. We are hosting Arabs Breaking the Silence Tour. And these are Arabs, both Christian and Muslim Arabs, who have, again, a different perspective of what is happening on the ground in Israel. And they're going to share the truth and what they've experienced living under the Israeli government. And of course, all of these, or most of the individuals who will be on the panel, are reservists. So they served, and they do continue to serve in the Israeli Defense Forces. So you won't want to miss that. If you've got high school students or college students, I want to encourage you to bring them along. It's very enlightening to hear the personal testimonials of these individuals. Also, March 1st, 4 p.m. at our International Christian Prayer and Action event for Israel. That will be in Nashville, Tennessee, on March 1st at the Gaylord Opryland Resort and Convention Center. And we're going to have a discussion at that event. We're going to talk with some of our media partners and have them share about the impact of our programs or our interviews on their networks. And I'm looking forward to greeting you if you're in the Nashville, Tennessee area. If you can join us from wherever you are, we would love to meet you. We'd love to see you there. Last week, as we move along into the program, last week we talked about the increase in European anti-Semitism. We also talked about the condemnation of Vice President Pence's speech, or his tweet, about the resurrection of the State of Israel during his visit to Yad Vashem in honor of the International Holocaust Remembrance. Tonight, we will continue to discuss the increase in European anti-Semitism and how revisionist history is fueling the age-old hatred. Additionally, we'll discuss a recent law passed in Poland in an attempt to censor history, revisionist history. If you've been following PJTN, you know this has been front and center with our organization. We've been exposing how the textbooks are presenting a false narrative to our children and revising history. But first, I want to open with the UN Human Rights Council, who released a report last week to create a database of companies doing business in Judea and Samaria, or what the world refers to as the West Bank. So I just want to give you a little bit of perspective. The United Nations, those of you who are familiar with PJTN, you know I also serve as a special envoy to the World Council of Independent Christian Churches at the United Nations. And there are attempts by many different organizations through the United Nations, like UNESCO, like UNRWA, and of course now the United Nations Human Rights Council, to revise history according to what they believe is an accurate perspective. And the Human Rights Council voted to adopt a report, or to establish a report of companies that are doing business in areas called Judea and Samaria, what we know as Judea and Samaria, the biblical heartland, but what they call the West Bank, or Israeli settlements. And of course, unfortunately, the Human Rights Council, though they did not name any particular organization, but they did mention a number of them, 22 of which are American companies. And so they are targeting these companies. They want to put pressure on these companies so that people will, instead of working with these companies or hiring these companies, purchasing their products, to intimidate them and pressure them by boycotting them because they're working with what they constitute an apartheid state. Which again, if you order the documentary Boycott This, you'll see that the only oppression going on in Israel is not by the Israeli government, but it's by the Palestinian leadership. It's by the Arabs. We know that in Bethlehem, since 1994, there were many Christians who lived in Bethlehem. But in 1993, under Oslo, the Palestinian Authority took over control of governing Bethlehem. Over 80% of the Christians who lived in Bethlehem have fled. If you look at the city of Nazareth, which many of us as Christians know, Bethlehem and Nazareth, those are two important cities to us and to our faith, because that's where Jesus, our Messiah, was born, Bethlehem, and Nazareth was where he grew up. And unfortunately, the Christians in Bethlehem have fled for their safety under a Palestinian Authority government. But here in Nazareth, under the Israeli government, you have not just Jews and Christians, but even Muslims who live together in that community. But the UN Human Rights Council's goal is to try to blacklist these companies and boycott, to push the boycott. There's a great article by Jonathan Tobin that was released earlier this week, and I want to quote from it. It says, the High Commissioner on Human Rights issued a report about companies doing business in the West Bank. The Geneva-based UN agency said it was examining the activities of 206 companies that are connected to Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria. Though it didn't name the companies, the intent was clear. The goal of the effort is to establish a list endorsed by the international community that would make it possible to boycott the 143 Israeli and 22 U.S. companies cited, as well as others. UN Ambassador Nikki Haley weighed in, she was quoted as saying that the UN, or the United States, had the right to denounce the step as a waste of time and evidence of the UN's anti-Israel obsession. And of course, we also know that Ambassador Haley has been outspoken about cutting back funding to different organizations within the United Nations because America, 22% of the UN budget comes from the United States taxpayer. That should make all of us equally upset about how our money is using in the halls of that international body to work against us and to undermine our only friend and ally in the Middle East, and that is the State of Israel. So again, the ambassador has weighed in, and we'll see what the Trump administration, what their policy is going to be with regards to the UN Human Rights Council and their activity to pursue this. But Nikki Haley did put out a statement last week with regards to that. She said that the whole issue is outside the bounds of the High Commissioner for Human Rights Office's mandate and is a waste of time and resources. While we note that they wisely refrain from listing individual companies, the fact that the report was issued at all is yet another reminder of the Council's anti-Israel obsession. The more the Human Rights Council does this, the less effective it becomes as an advocate against the world's human rights abusers. The United States will continue to aggressively push back against the anti-Israel bias and advance badly needed reforms of the Council. So this is encouraging to see, to hear this response from the ambassador. But again, it's amazing because the United Nations was the body that formally founded and voted to establish the modern state of Israel. So it's shocking to see that this is actually taking place in this body, but amazing how time changes things. You know, we're 72 years out from the Holocaust, and it's amazing how people have forgotten. Moving on, I want to talk about Poland, and Poland has made the news, and it's not just Poland. There's a couple of other European countries we're going to talk about tonight with regards to the anti-Semitic rhetoric that is being promoted, not just in some of the laws that are being passed in European countries, but even the BDS movement that is still being fueled in the country of Ireland. And, you know, fortunately for PJTN, because our programs are broadcasting all over the globe, we have PJTN watchmen that are stationed all over the world. And we've got a team that is actually in Ireland that is trying to stop the BDS movement. And there was a legislator in their parliament who introduced a bill to boycott, divest, and sanction Israel. It's unfortunate because we look at a lot of these European countries, and many of which are Christian countries. A few years ago, we did a screening in Tipperary, Ireland, and the documentary film that we screened was Israel Indivisible, The Case for the Ancient Homeland. Again, award-winning documentary film that you can find on our website if you haven't seen it. It's something that you certainly want to keep in your library for information for the future, for your children, for your grandchildren. It's a great resource. But we screened the film, and then we did a Skype interview following the film with members of the audience. And it was shocking to me to hear some of the comments. You know, I did some research on Ireland, and, you know, Ireland is still predominantly Catholic and a Protestant country. And as we were talking about the facts that we presented in Israel Indivisible, in that film, we made the case historically, archaeologically, biblically, and legally that Israel has rights to her ancient homeland. There is no other people group that land belongs to. God made a covenant with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and their descendants forever, and that covenant is still intact. But it was shocking to me toward the end of the discussion, a woman said to me, well, you're talking about the Bible, and we're not very Christian here. And I remarked to her that despite whether she agreed with my interpretation of the scriptures or not, I did mention to her that God's truth still stands, whether we believe it or whether we accept it or not. It doesn't change because we don't agree with a biblical principle or a truth, a biblical truth that is laid out in the scriptures. And it was shocking to me to hear that come from someone who probably was of the Catholic faith, who made that comment. But this is what's happening throughout Europe. It's happening even here in the United States. We're turning away from the Bible. We're turning away from our faith, and we're becoming more of a faithless society. And it's so critically important as Christians that we study and that we read our Bible, that we understand the events and situations that are happening and occurring around the world from a biblical perspective. What is our role? What is our responsibility? And the only way we're going to get that is through studying God's Word, through the power of His Holy Spirit, His revelation, and through prayer. And so I want to encourage you to not be deceived, because here were people who obviously once were in the church, or were in a Catholic country, predominantly Catholic, but also Protestant country, and they rejected even the evidence that was shared with them, the biblical evidence, the legal evidence, the archaeological evidence that is presented, the historical evidence. But they didn't want to hear it, because their perspective was what the modern day leaders, global leaders, tell us the perspective should be, or what our understanding should be. You know, if we go back to the Bible and the covenant that God made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, He also made a covenant with Ishmael, which was one of His sons. It was the first son of His concubine. And He said of Ishmael that He would make Ishmael's descendants a great nation. 12 princes would come from them, but they would inhabit the land to the east. And the only way we would know that is if we actually read through the book of Genesis. If we read the story, you know, the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis deal with God and creation, His creation, how He created the earth. But starting in Genesis chapter 12 is where God starts His story about a people whom He chose, about a man that He cut a covenant with, and his descendants that He made that covenant forever. It is an eternal covenant. And as we read through the scriptures from Genesis 12 through Revelation, we see that same story, that same narrative of Israel being regathered, bringing her back. She was scattered, but God promised her He would regather her, and He would bring her back into that land. She would inhabit that land. And ladies and gentlemen, looking at what has happened historically and understanding that we're alive, we are the generation to witness this move of God, this prophecy to be fulfilled, it should make all of us humble. It should also cause all of us to think about why we're here, why God put us on this earth at this hour, why you're tuning in to this program tonight, why you care about Israel, why you love the Jewish people. This isn't just coincidence that all of these things come together, that they all add up. If God put us on this planet at this hour, then there's a reason. It reminds me of the story of Esther. Purim, the holiday of Purim, is coming up soon. And Queen Esther, who was faced with a dilemma, she was in the palace with the king. She was the wife of the king, but she hid her identity of being Jewish. And when she found out from her cousin Mordecai that Haman plotted to kill all the Jews of Persia at that time, that's modern day Iran, and all the provinces of Persia at that time, she had a choice. She didn't want to go initially before the king because she knew that if she went uninvited, it could cost her her life. But she decided to go ahead. She asked all the Jews of Persia to join with her and to pray, to fast and pray with her. And then if she died, she died, but she would intervene on her family's behalf. These are biblical truths and stories to help us, to encourage us in our faith, to help us understand that we have a role. We should never second guess the position of leadership that God has given to each one of us. We have the information, we're educated about this issue, we read our Bibles, we pray. And it's critically important that we apply what we know, that we don't just keep what we're learning to ourselves. You know, in Joel chapter 1, verse 3, we're commanded to teach these truths, to teach the Torah, to teach the Bible to our children, our grandchildren, and our great-grandchildren. That is why we, this year at the National Religious Broadcasters Convention, are going to launch our new campaign to ignite the torch to the next generation. We have to reach the next generation of Christian and Jewish communicators and media professionals. We need to reach them with this message because they are the ones that we are going to one day ultimately pass the torch to, and they will have to carry this should the Lord tarry. But they're not going to know unless we teach them. And you never know the impact of what you teach your children, how it may come back to bless you, that it would multiply toward you. But we look at what's happening in these countries in Europe, as I said earlier, these are predominantly Christian countries. And how can this happen? You know, when we produced our documentary, The Forgotten People, Christianity and the Holocaust, and I want to encourage you, if you have not seen that film, again, you can visit our website, go to our store page, and order a copy. This is what it looks like, The Forgotten People, Christianity and the Holocaust. This documentary goes into the history of Christian anti-Semitism. I remember when I became a Christian, I did not know the history of Christianity. When you accept Jesus as your Lord and Savior, you don't go through a class that teaches you the history of Christianity. You just move forward from that day. But it's important that we study history, because as we study history, if we know our past, then we will know our destiny. We will know our future. And as I was studying the Holocaust, one of the things that bothered me about the Holocaust was Germany. Germany was a Christian, it was what you would call, what we call today the United States, a Judeo-Christian nation. It was also a Judeo-Christian nation. It was an educated nation. Many parents took their kids to German universities, much like here in the United States. The United States is a Judeo-Christian nation. We're an educated nation. The United States sends missionaries out to the four corners of the world to bring the gospel of the kingdom message. And Germany was the nation that gave us the birth of the Reformation movement. And unfortunately, there were many silent Germans who stood by, who didn't pay attention to what was going on. And if they did pay attention, they didn't speak up. Now, there were some Germans who did try to protect the Jews, but there were too many that were silent. And many Germans tried to say we didn't know what was going on. But ladies and gentlemen, in the cities where they had the crematoria, where the Jews were being burned and incinerated, there were ashes of people's bodies falling down like snowflakes on these cities. And you could smell the stench in the air. So people can't say that they didn't know, and we today cannot say that we don't know that anti-Semitism is on the rise. The Anti-Defamation League put out a report last year stating that there's an increase of 86% of anti-Semitism around the globe. In the United States, which is the most shocking, the United States saw an almost 70% increase in anti-Semitism. Most of these incidents are happening on college campuses. And unfortunately, it's the type of rhetoric that we see in Germany, in Poland, where we are seeing even the Polish government who's revising its laws, changing its laws in order to make it a crime if anyone calls the Polish or the death camps in Poland Polish death camps. The government is disturbed that many people don't realize that these were Nazi death camps. And though that is true, they were constructed by the Nazis. But there were almost 3 million Jews and another 1.9 million Poles who were murdered in Poland. And unfortunately, the Polish government has decided to pass a law that is going to censor anyone who accuses Poland of being involved or complicit in the Holocaust. Alan Dershowitz put out a great a statement this week, and he said that Poland's national government is in the process of enacting legislation to criminalize speech that claims publicly and contrary to the facts that the Polish nation or the Republic of Poland is responsible or co-responsible for Nazi crimes committed by the Third Reich. The proposal would exempt artistic or academic activity, but would prohibit ordinary citizens and politicians from accusing Poland of complicity in the number of 3 million Polish Jews. Both the Israeli and U.S. governments have denounced the proposal, which restricts free speech and falsifies history. It is this type of rhetoric, it is this type of initiative by the government. This government, the Polish government, should not be enacting laws to criminalize people who are having a discussion. The people can argue about the facts of history, or they can argue about their perspective, but for the government to make it illegal to accuse or tie Poland, the Polish government, with the Nazis as criminal. And I believe it's punishable by 6 years imprisonment. The article goes on to say the Germans built Auschwitz and other death camps on Polish soil, but the Germans could not have murdered the Polish Jews and millions of other Europeans imported to death camps in Poland without the active assistance of many Poles in identifying and rounding up victims. Again, remember, Poland was predominantly a Catholic country. Yes, we know that there were many Catholics, there were priests who were protecting the Jews. I had dinner a couple of weeks ago with a dear friend of mine whose mother survived in Poland, and unfortunately the mother had to go, actually went to a Polish home, and she stayed in a barn where the family eventually found her, and she was protected by this family, and the family kept her. We know that at Yad Vashem, in the Garden of the Righteous, that of the 23,000 people who are buried there, that the majority of them are Polish. They were people who tried to protect the Jewish people from being annihilated, but there were still many more Poles who turned their back. And even afterwards, nothing in this law that Poland just passed, there's nothing that talks about how when the survivors, the Jewish survivors in Poland, when they went back after the war to try to retake their property, they were banished from the country. They were denied their citizenship. It was revoked, and they could not, and all of their homes, their property was confiscated. And of course, there's nothing stated here in this law about that part of Polish history. Even after the liberation of the concentration camps, after World War II, there were still pogroms where Poles killed Jews. But again, that's not communicated in this story. And unless you read between the lines, unless you study history, you don't know that these things have gone on. The article, Alan Dershowitz's article, goes on to say Poland's role in the Holocaust is a mixed picture of complicity, heroism, complacency, and willful blindness. It is up to historians to sort out the specifics and moralists to apportion the blame, but it is not the role of law to stifle debate and to threaten those who question the current self-serving Polish narrative. Several Europeans have made the Holocaust denial a crime. As I was researching for tonight's program, I knew about what was happening in Turkey with the revisionist history going on with the Armenian genocide. If you're not familiar with that, a couple of years ago at the United Nations during a conference, the Turkish ambassador to the UN stood up and told the United Nations that they did not appreciate the way the Armenian war with Turkey was being communicated, that there were many Turks, Muslims who died in that Armenian war as well. And so we see this growing problem with revisionist history again happening, and it's laws like this being passed in Poland that are helping to fuel this history, this perspective of history. There was another AP article that states it's currently written the legislation calls for prison for up to 3 years, I'm sorry, I stand corrected, for falsely attributing the crimes of Nazi Germany to Poland. It goes on to say Poland's authorities have described it as an attempt to protect the country's reputation from what it believes is confusion about who bears responsibility for Auschwitz and other death camps Nazi Germany set up in occupied Poland. Polish officials have long argued a Holocaust speech law is needed to fight expressions like Polish death camps for the Nazi camps where Jews and others were exterminated. The Prime Minister of Poland said it would not prohibit Holocaust survivors and witnesses from talking about crimes committed by individual Poles against them. He's quoted as saying, "We do not deny that there were cases of huge wickedness," he said in a speech. Beda Mazurek, a spokeswoman for the Conservative Law and Justice and a deputy parliament speaker, tweeted a quote by a Catholic priest who had said that the Israeli ambassador's criticism of the bill made it hard for me to look at Jews with sympathy and kindness. Let me repeat that one more time. A Catholic priest tweeted out that the Israeli ambassador's criticism of the bill made it hard for me to look at Jews with sympathy and kindness. That is a Catholic priest. Obviously, that Catholic priest has forgotten about Nostra Aetate. And for those of you who are not Catholic and those of you who are Catholic tuning in tonight who are not familiar with Nostra Aetate, Nostra Aetate was adopted in 1965. And it was the Catholic Church's final statement condemning anti-Semitism. The Pope John Paul said that you cannot be a good Catholic and be an anti-Semite. And unfortunately, this Catholic priest must not be aware of Nostra Aetate, nor did he read the document. But Nostra Aetate also stated that Catholics can no longer say that the Jews are no longer in covenant with God. They are. And part of that covenant includes the land of Israel that God gave to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their descendants forever. And here's a Catholic priest who's going to incite. In fact, we saw reports of anti-Semitic incidents and anti-Semitism on the rise in Poland since the passage of this law and the outcry from nations like the United States and Israel. There was another statement that that sounded more like something out of the protocols of the Elders of Zion. Many conservative lawmakers and commentators, are now accusing Israelis and American Jews of using the issue as a pretext for getting money from Poland for pre-war Jewish property seized in the communist era. Jerry Szerzinski, a senator with the ruling party, said on state radio Monday that he saw a hidden agenda in the opposition. And here's a quote, "After all, we know that Jewish circles, including American, but mostly the state of Israel, are trying to get restitution of property or at least compensation," he said. This again sounds like a quote out of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a book that was listed as a fraud by a court in Russia back in 1993. And here are these Poles, a senator of the ruling party, making such outrageous statements. This is very disturbing, ladies and gentlemen. This is what is fueling the rise of anti-Semitism. Many people were surprised when lawmakers suddenly approved it on January 26, the day before the International Holocaust Remembrance Day. If there was ever a slap in the face to the 6 million Jews who perished in the Holocaust and those who are living and their children who are alive today, it is this event, this law being passed in Poland. Very insulting. But ladies and gentlemen, as we talked about revisionist history, it's not just Poland where this is going on. I found an article also on the web in 2015. Ukraine's president signed a law whose critics say stifled debate on the historical record of World War II and whitewashes local perpetrators of the Holocaust. The law criminalized any rhetoric insulting to the memory of anti-communist partisans, and it celebrates the legacy of such combatants, ostensibly including the ones who murdered countless Jewish and Polish citizens while collaborating with Nazi Germany. The law generated some backlash, including an open letter by more than 70 historians who said it contradicts the right to freedom of speech, ignores complicity in the Holocaust, and would damage Ukraine's national security. The United States and Israel joined the historians and Israel's Yad Vashem's Holocaust Authority in decrying the bill. The Ukrainian and Polish laws are similar. Holocaust revision in Ukraine is much like what's happening in other countries. We see it in Latvia. We see it in other countries where, again, revisionist history, we're 72 years out from the Holocaust. And now we have people, countries. It reminds me of General Patton. In fact, we have that historical footage you all may remember in this documentary. General Patton, when he liberated the concentration camps, and he told all of the people with the cameras to videotape and to film everything they saw here and take pictures, because one day somebody would come along and say, this didn't happen. Ladies and gentlemen, we're rewriting our history books. We're teaching our children a different narrative. We're presenting bias and disinformation to try to manipulate the next generation in changing our laws and our way of life. And the United States is just one country. It's so critically important that we are engaged in what is happening in our schools, especially our secondary schools. What is being taught to our children? What's in the history textbooks? For those of you who've been involved with PJTN, you know that we have been at the front line of fighting this battle and mobilizing communities in Florida, Tennessee, New York, Massachusetts, Texas, Ohio, Colorado, all across the country. A couple of years ago, when we exposed the content in the textbooks here in Williamson County, the belt buckle of the Bible Belt, we exposed a quote in the textbook that legitimized Palestinians blowing themselves up in a Jerusalem restaurant because they were waging a war against Israeli government policies and army actions. And when we exposed that, Fox News picked up the story, and we started to hear from parents and citizens all over the country about the content that they were finding in their children's textbooks. Many of you who are watching tonight, your state may be reviewing your history, geography, and social studies textbooks this year. We will be here in Tennessee. This is the time for parents, for PJTN Watchmen to get involved. And if you're interested in being a part of it, last week we talked about the training that we're doing with textbooks. If you're interested in reviewing textbooks in your community, we want to hear from you. Please email us at comments@pjtn.org. And as I'm giving you and sharing all this information, I also want to remind all of our viewers tonight that if you have any questions or any comments, anything that you want to share, we would love to hear from you. And so I want to encourage you to sign on and to write me a question make a statement. I'm going to be taking questions here shortly in just a little bit, but we would love to hear from you. And of course, you can always write to us at comments@pjtn.org and share your thoughts about the program. And again, I want to reiterate that that we have an opportunity right now. We were born and we were gifted with all the gifts and the abilities that we have for such a time as this. And just like Esther rose to be queen of Persia in Shushan, just as she never, if somebody told her when she was a little girl that one day she would be a queen over Persia, she never probably would have believed it, but she found herself in an incredible moment in time and history. And she stood up and she did the right thing. We each, as leaders in our own families, in our own communities, have the opportunity to make a difference. We have the opportunity to speak up against anti-Semitism. We have the opportunity to condemn what's happening on our college campuses. Here in Tennessee, we just introduced the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act. Ohio will be introducing it as well shortly. But our goal with the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act is to establish the U.S. State Department's definition of what constitutes anti-Semitism, excuse me, so that we can recognize anti-Semitic incidents when they occur, so that people can speak out. So I want to we've got about 13 minutes before the end of the program, and I want to use this time to take some of your questions. So if you want to go ahead and just respond with any questions. Let's see who we have on here. Let me refresh. Excuse me. Thank you all for joining us. Greg, justice is a battle. Yes, it is, Greg. It is a battle. But justice, justice, thou must pursue. We're commanded by Almighty God to pursue justice. And when we see injustice, we have to speak up. And Greg, I appreciate you saying that, because it's not going to be easy. It never is easy. Fighting for truth has never been easy. Standing up and doing the right thing is not easy. Dave says they cannot change history, minimize, or ignore what happened by a vote. No, you're right, Dave. They can't. We know history, and that's why it's important that we continue to communicate history despite what they do, to try to silence free speech. And really, it's a violation of their country's free speech to be able to communicate. It's one thing for the country to have a moral discussion or a conversation or launch an education initiative or campaign in their country about these issues and put out, hire a good media consultant to put this information out. But for a government to restrict the conversation, the voice of the people, is oppressive. It's very dangerous. And for our supporters in Poland, I pray to God that you are pushing back at your elected officials and challenging them on this. This is not a step in the right direction. It's not a step in correcting error in history or what people perceive. It's very dangerous. Myrna says history can be rewritten on paper, but it can't be changed. Yes, Myrna, it cannot be changed. And that's why watching and reviewing our children's textbooks, and for those of you who may not have children in the school system, I hear from citizens who say, well, I don't have children in the school system. I've already raised my kids. We are taxpayers. We pay for the textbooks that are being used in our public schools. We have a legal right. I was having this conversation earlier today that every generation that is born as an American citizen has a duty, a responsibility to protect and uphold our constitutional republic. We've gotten lax in recent years. We are not paying attention to what is being taught to our children. Instead, we're teaching our children that communism, Nazism, Maoism, all the different socialism are just other forms of government. We're not teaching our children that they are oppressive, that capitalism, and that our constitutional republic is worth fighting for. It's why people sell everything that they can to come to the United States, legally, I would add. I know we're not going to get into the immigration debate here tonight, but my great-grandparents came over here. They sold everything that they had in Portugal to be here. And of course they came in legally. But each generation is responsible to protect this Constitution that God has given to us, and then to preserve it and hand it to the next generation. If we keep on the same trajectory that we are, ladies and gentlemen, there is going to be no one to pass our constitutional republic to, because our children aren't going to know what a constitutional republic is. Our children aren't going to know that their rights are being taken away from them because they don't know what's in the Constitution. They don't know the Bill of Rights. That's why it's so important. That's why we can't allow governments, as citizens of countries, we can't allow governments like Poland to take a part of history that they don't quite like and rewrite it and make it illegal to say otherwise. That's outrageous. So I'm going to take a couple of more questions before we wrap up the program tonight. Again, I want to thank you all for being with us. We have, let me see. Is it Islam? Here's a question. Is it Islam or revised Nazi influence behind unrest in Poland? That's a good question. And I think the key thing here is that this is what's left over from the Nazis.